Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to walk you through how I export videos in Cinema 4D, particularly for the vertical format for Instagram stories and for the Reels. And in this video I'm going to walk you through how you can set up Cinema 4D to start up in these settings so that you don't have to each time set up the export functions, but rather you can start up Cinema 4D with already these settings already in place, and so it saves you a lot of time as you're able to automate your workflow and make it much more efficient for yourself. So in this video I'm going to walk you through how you can optimize your startup in Cinema 4D in order to export Instagram stories and Reels in high quality, but also with an efficient workflow so that it saves you time but also produces high quality renders for your Instagram stories and Reels. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe. So in terms of understanding how to export for Instagram, I think it's first good to understand that typically what I do is I'll export to 1080 by 1920. This is the vertical dimension that I typically will export and then upload to Instagram, and this allows me to optimize for quality but also for time and efficiency. And I'll walk you through how I borrowed some tips from the Mind in Motion course that I recently finished, and I'll take particularly some tips and examples from that course, kind of highlighting some of the things that the course covered in terms of exporting to Instagram and also setting up your workspace as well as your startup so that you already have kind of a lot of these export functions already set up before you even create your render. So typical dimensions, again, as I mentioned, is 1080 by 1920. And then what I'll typically be doing is using 24 frames per second in the settings. And so in order to get that in Cinema 4D, you're going to go to the output, which is the first render setting category. And you do have all these different presets already that you can already choose from. But if you simply just want to select 1080 by 1920, you can also do that. And nothing really else you have to change here, but I'm going to walk you through how you can set up this automatically in your startup. But for now, I'm just going to explain these are typically the settings that I'll use. And so again, 24 frames per second. And my timelines can run from 90 frames to up to 400, but typically they're at least around 200 typically. So that's can be about a 10-second to 15-second clip depending on the frame rate. And then in terms of, so what I'm first going to do is just walk you through the settings that I use, and then I'm gonna later discuss how you can set up Cinema 4D so that it startups, it kind of will already generate these export functions when you're opening Cinema 4D. So to go into the save function, a key tip here is that a lot of when I first started, right, I used .movie or .mp4, so that's when you can export as a movie. However, the challenge with that is that if Cinema 4D crashes, then you have the risk of losing that entire file. Whereas if you use JPEG or PNG, you're only gonna lose up to the last frame that you rendered, right? So that's why a lot of the workflow that I've been discovering is to export in JPEGs and then create an image sequence in post so that you can create a movie file from those each image sequences in terms of each frame that's rendered. And the challenge is which format to choose in terms of image. And what I've learned and I've understood to do is to use JPEG. You can use PNG if you want just a higher quality. So if I was exporting to YouTube where the quality was really important to me, I would be probably picking PNG. But JPEG does a really good job, and I would say enough for what is needed in terms of uploading to Instagram. So in that course I mentioned Mind and Motion course, he recommends to use JPEG when he uses his workflow in terms of uploading to Instagram. And another key feature when saving your file is what I do is I'll have in Dropbox a render folder. That way I can basically choose the render folder. It's here somewhere. So what this allows me to do is then I'll export to this same folder each time, and then I can export all my renders to the same folder, so that doesn't, you know, when you have like 200 image sequences, it can really easily populate a folder, and you can get kind of disorganized very quickly. So, in terms of uploading to Dropbox folder, that way I have two computers, right? So when I have my laptop and I'm on the run, if I just want to see where my export is at in terms of Cinema 4D, I'll find the latest image exported and upload it to Dropbox. That way I can get the kind of where I'm at in terms of my render, even when I'm away from my home. But the key, I guess, too, is that you could, people can, screen drop into your computer basically, and I guess you could just observe it that way as well. But if you just want to have a quick way to have a shared folder that has all your images in it, Dropbox or some other cloud service is I think a good way to export to, because the images aren't really that big as well. Click all these different preferences, so when you save, it automatically will populate these different features. So typically what I'll do is I'll have the year, month, and then day. And so it will automatically, here I'll show you. So let's just say we're going to create a completely new folder. You could create the year by a dash maybe, month, and then by another dash, and day. And then what I'll typically do is have another dash, and then I'll name my file. But this way, it will easily, you can just know which date that your render file was created, and then all you have to do is simply add a title. That way you can already have this populated each time, and I think that's a quick way to save time. And I don't really tend to mess with any of these other settings in terms of multipass. There is more complex workflows where you could export as a JPEG, as a Photoshop file, or if you wanted to maybe even a TIFF, which is the high quality image. But for, like I mentioned, for Instagram purposes, JPEG I think does the job. And then in the Redshift render settings, so what I've learned is here are my typical settings that I'll use. Typically I'll use a denoiser, and so I'll click on denoise, and that allows you to obviously clean up the noise that's in your export. And I find that especially if you have a lot of animation and lights in your scene, I would say denoising is actually a very important aspect to use. It will make the renders longer, but I think you're going to get better quality, right, in terms of your images just being cleaner and sharper and less noise. In terms of what else I change is I'll go into systems, so in the advanced settings, and I'll click on bucket size 512, and I use a Mac M1 Max, and I understand that can handle the 512 bucket size, and it's just basically the bucket in terms of the amount that it's going to render at one time in terms of a square, or in terms of a bucket. And there's other ways to render in terms of progressive rendering, but for this video I'm just going to mention that typically I'll be using 512. I believe 128 is the standard. And in terms of motion blur, I may sometimes use motion blur, and in the basics settings, typically I'll be clicking denoising, and then if motion blur, if it's needed, I'll use motion blur, depending on the project. If there's some animation and you want to create some motion blur, it will add to the render, but it's going to give you that cinematic look as well. And I typically will keep to the low bucket setting only in when I'm kind of rendering the file within the Redshift render view. But when I'm exporting, I'll be typically using medium to high. And if I was using like a client project or a very high quality render that I wanted to create, I would use very high. And other than that, in the settings, I don't think there's much else to change. You want to make sure, I think from what I've learned from the Mind and Motion course, and I recommend that course to take, is to use primary G engine, use brute force, as well as a secondary engine, use brute force. I believe it's the irradiance point cloud is the typical standard setting. From what I've learned is brute force with global illumination is important. And other than this, I don't tend to touch any of these settings. As I mentioned, when I'm just rendering and working with the file and the image, I'm going to be using the bucket quality low quality, and then when I'm rendering, I'm going to use the medium to high. And what you can do too is you can save these render settings. Let me look here. Yeah, so you can save the preset. So let's say that you wanted this to be low quality Instagram post. And then so if you wanted to just load these different render settings, all you have to do is then go into the preset and it will automatically, you can change it, right? So what I might do is I might work with a low quality Instagram post, and then I would do a separate one. Let me look here. So I would save the preset, but this time I would change over to high here, say, and I would then again save it as a preset, and instead of it being low quality, I'll say high quality. This way what I can do is then I can just go like this, load the preset and put high quality. So if let's say I'm using low quality here, I can go from low quality to high quality. Well, anyway, I believe that's the way that you can set it up, is that you can quickly create these different render settings so that you can quickly get to the render settings that you want. And so those are what I consider when using Redshift. And then Magic Bullet Looks is a way that you can create a look, in the post effects. So I'm not going to go into depth about Magic Bullet Looks. These are the typical settings that I'm using. I'm adding Mojo, Renoiser, I'm adding a vignette, I'm adding a halation and a diffusion. And it's a little bit overkill when it's 100%. But typically I'll lower it down to maybe around 20 or so. Yeah, those are typically my settings. And then I'll also show you the effects. So these are the post effects that you can add. And so once you go into effects, it'll generate this category here. You can add a LUT. So that's sometimes I will actually add a LUT, and you can, if you have a bunch of LUTs, you can just upload a LUT here, and then you can obviously change the strength of the LUT and how strong it is. And other thing I'll do is I tend to adjust the color. So typically I'll be using an S curve. So by clicking Command and just clicking on the line here, you can create an S curve. So upping the midtones and upping the highlights and then lowering the shadows. And so you can do that very easily in the RGBT curves here. Blooming. So these are just for your own creative application. What you think the image needs, but you could add some blooming, and it's obviously a bit overkill when you first use it, but if you dial it down quite a bit, you can typically get a good look, I would say. Also flaring, so if you wanted to add a flare, again, you probably have to lower the intensity because it's quite strong out of the gate, and you can also create a streak. And if you wanted to also create a background, you can also render a background in post. But those are the the post effects settings that I'll typically use. I might add a LUT. I will usually add an S curve to the RGBT curve, and also I might add some blooming, but just very subtly. And then so that's the export functions that I use for rendering in Cinema 4D to create a high quality image in Instagram. When I open up Cinema 4D, it will open up this exact setup. So in order to do that, I put a platonic and a couple cloners, so you don't have to obviously have that. But let's just say that was off and I just wanted a blank space, right? And a blank background. Then what I would do is if I wanted to open up this each time, to make it very simple, I would go into Window, and then you go into Customization, and then you go into Save as Startup Layout. And that you got to make sure though that you have all the settings that you want, and you save it as your startup layout. And then you can also save layout as, and that allows you to create different layouts depending on your needs. And then what you also might want to do is also, let's say you're satisfied with the Windows and the desktop, the way it's set up, you can then also save as default scene, so that each time it will open into this default scene. And the final thing I'm going to show you is just to ensure that when you are rendering, to ensure that your project settings are the same, or sorry, your scene settings are the same as your render settings. So here are your render settings, right? And you have your frame rate and your output as 24 frames, or you could have 30. But typically in the standard, when you open up Cinema 4D for the first time, it will be 30 frames per second. But it's important to have the same frame rate as your export. That's something that I didn't catch when I first started in Cinema 4D. But that's all you basically need to do to understand creating high quality 3D renders for Instagram, for the stories and for the reels. And this way you can set it up right out of the gate, so that when you open Cinema 4D, you're already going to have the story format. You're already going to have, maybe you have some objects already in your, or platonics in your scene, and you can also have all your render settings already set up so that you don't have to change them each time, which can be a headache and take a lot of time. So in this video, I covered the different features that setting up a high quality render for Instagram stories and for Reels. And I also shared with you how you can set this up so it's your startup setting when you open up Cinema 4D, which saves you a lot of time and efficiency. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.